John Henry Hopkins. He was an American clergyman, and he was a hymnodist in the 19th century. He was born in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. He had 12 siblings. Now, John's Irish father, he founded the Vermont Episcopal Institute, like a Bible school, and his father hired him, John Henry, to help run the school, to be a tutor, a disciplinarian in it. But John was very gifted in music, and he played the flute and the bugle for the school orchestra. And after helping the school for a while with his father, he went to go study to further his education. He graduated, he returned, but within the year, the school had to shut down because of financial reasons. This forced John Henry Hopkins to find a new job. He found a job as a journalist. However, that wasn't his passion, so he decided to enroll into seminary. So he enrolled in the General Theological Seminary, which is pretty much the Episcopal Church Seminary in New York City. In 1850, he graduated. He became a rector and a professor at the seminary. He studied at. He became its first music teacher between 1855 and 1857. And so what does a gifted musician and a gifted professor do with one's time? Well, you write hymns. That's what he does. In fact, during his time as a professor, he composed several hymns. And his most famous hymn wasn't actually written for the seminary, but it was for a local Christmas pageant that his nieces and nephews were a part of. He wrote for this Christmas pageant a well-known Christmas carol, We Three Kings. We Three Kings, written in 1857. And I'm sure most of you know this song. The hymn pretty much concerns the biblical magi we see in Matthew chapter 2, the ones who visited Jesus, hence the name We Three Kings. However, this old hymn, as well as some other traditional Christmas understandings of these wise men, have largely engraved in us a very unfortunate idea of these people that's not really found in the text in the Bible. We have many ideas of who these kings, these magi were, that's not really biblical. And so what are some misconceptions that some people have with these wise men? Well, let's look at a few of these misconceptions briefly. Well, first, the song, as well as traditional nativities, often calls these magi kings. However, Matthew chapter 2 doesn't call them kings. Matthew uses the Greek word magos to refer to these men. He uses a different word in the same chapter to refer to King Herod. So different words, different people. These are not kings. Second, and I'm sure many of you know this one, most traditional nativities and stuff like that have three kings. The text doesn't mention there were three kings, just three gifts. Third, were the magi even Orient? We three kings Orient are. Orient meaning from the far east. Well, Matthew just says they're from the east. So there's lots of options between Jerusalem all the way east. So it's really speculation where they came from. And to be fair, there actually was a legend during medieval times in Europe. The legend of John Prester, who held that there was a great and powerful monarch in the far east. The legend said this monarch was the successor of these magi. And the story was given to help explain why there were Christians all the way in Mongolia during the Middle Ages. So were they Orient? Well, it's possible, but probably not. Fourth, another misconception of these magi, and we often see this in nativity scenes, them coming to the stable where Jesus is born. They weren't there. They weren't there at the stable. They weren't there when Jesus was in the manger. The account in Matthew indicates they came much later. For example, in Matthew 2 verse 9, it says they followed the star not to where he was born, but where he was. Matthew uses a specific word for the child. Doesn't use the word for infant. He uses the word for child, someone a bit older. In Matthew 2 verse 9, it says Mary and Jesus were in a house when the magi joined them, not the stable. And then also when Herod tried to kill the people, he chose everyone 2 and under in Bethlehem. And some other reasons why, but the Magi weren't there when Jesus was born, that came a bit later. In other words, either I'm just a Christmas Grinch, ruining, kids' nativities. Now, I've taken away 3 roles for little kids being the kings. But so what is the Magi text about? And that's my goal this evening, to go through the text about the Magi. And that's my Christmas sermon this evening. So you're welcome to turn with me to Matthew chapter 2, like I said. And since the text is long, I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to go through it as we go through. And so what I've done, I've divided my sermon into 2 parts. 2 parts that will contrast 2 different kings. 2 different kings. One is an imposter. The other one is the true king. And after going through this text, my prayer is that you will be encouraged to know who is the true king, whom we worship. We shall see the imposter Herod versus the true King Jesus, and what the Magi account tells us in the midst of this. So let's begin with the first part, the imposter king of the Jews. He's the imposter. And then we'll look at the true king of the Jews a bit later. So now, I don't know if you know this, but when you read of Herod in the Bible, there's actually more than one Herod. In history, there's lots more, but in the Bible, there's 3 Herods. Not all Herods are the same Herod, and there are actually 3 generations of Herods in the Bible. And so sometimes we forget this. When we're reading the Bible, we forget there are decades of time between the Gospels, in the beginning of the Gospels and the book of Acts, we read about Herod. And so sometimes we think it's the same Herod, but it's not. There's Herod the Great. He's the Herod right in the beginning of the Gospels. There is Herod Antipas, which is Herod the Great's son. You read him later. There's Herod Agrippa I, who's Herod the Great's grandson. Now, the Herod of our text in Matthew 2 is Herod the Great, the original Herod. His son, like I said, he appears later in the Gospels. His son is the one who executes John the Baptist. Then his grandson is the one who's in the book of Acts, who gets struck down by the angel of the Lord. So all 3 Herods are bad. It's not a good name. Don't call your son Herod. It's not a good name to call him. So when we read Matthew 2 verse 1, we're reading about the first Herod, Herod the Great. Herod the Great. You look at Matthew 2 verse 1, it says, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. So this is Herod the Great. He was reigning in the area during the birth of Jesus. So who was King Herod the Great? Now, I think if you want to fully appreciate what's going on in this text, we must understand a bit of history of Herod the Great. Who is he? Who is he? Well, first, the title the Great is not actually referring to his magnificence, but it was a title given to him by an ancient Jewish historian, Josephus, and it simply was his way to distinguish this Herod from the other Herods. It refers to him as being Herod the Older, the first Herod, the greater one. So Herod the Great, he ruled over and from Jerusalem under the Romans. The Romans really controlled everything, but they allowed certain regions of their empire to sort of run themselves. But Herod the Great, he ruled the region of Jerusalem from 37 to 4 BC. He died just after Jesus was born. So who was he? Well, if you were in our church, we went through the book of Obadiah. You would remember that Herod was an Idumean. So what is that? Well, the Jewish people called those people half-breeds. He was half Jewish, half Edomite. Even that Jewish historian calls him a half-Jew. Herod's father was by descent an Edomite, but his ancestors had converted to Judaism. So the reality is he wasn't even half Jewish. His father converted at some point. So he was Jewish by upbringing, not by ancestry. Additionally, one of the early church fathers said that his father was also from Ashkelon, which is in Philistia. So he's got Edomite in him, he's got Philistine in him. And so it's a pretty explosive combo to come and run and rule Jerusalem. Now, Herod the Great's father was a man named Antipater. Now, Antipater helped support the Romans, their rulers' rise to power in the region in 63 BC. And because of his help, Herod's father Antipater, The Romans made him the governor of Judea. His goal was, though, he was trying to make favor with the Romans so that one day one of his sons could reign in his place. And we know one of them did. And so Antipater, he's ruling in Judea, trying to make the Romans very happy. And he did. He did to an extent. And Herod, his one son, also got favor from the Romans and noticed his military skills. However, after the assassination of the Roman dictator Julius Caesar, if you remember your history, he was assassinated by members of his own republic. Antipater now has to choose a side. There's a civil war. Is he going to choose the people who assassinated the dictator, the emperor, or is he going to join the side that is trying to resist it? For the Romans, like I said, have the civil war. And so Antipater had to choose a side, and he ended up being forced to side with the people who killed Julius Caesar. He sided with the senator Gaius Cassius Longinus, and he was one of the leading instigators who assassinated Julius Caesar. Against him was the Roman general Mark Antony and Julius's adopted son Octavius, the one who later became Emperor Augustus, mentioned in Luke chapter 2. And so Gaius, this guy who organized this assassination, Gaius Cassius, he forced Herod's father, King Antipater, to give a heavy tribute to his side of the Roman civil war. And Antipater wasn't too pleased. And the problem was, when you displease the Romans, they end up killing you, which they did. They sent someone to poison his food, and so they killed him. This meant the throne over Judea was empty, and in the middle of a civil war, it can be pretty easy for someone to take and seize power right now. So Herod's relative, another man, Antigonus, he went and took the throne, but Herod the Great believed it was his throne, and he wasn't just going to give this throne to some random person. So what Herod did, he went to the other Romans, Mark Antony and Octavius, and he said, I will support you if you give me the throne when we win. And they agreed. And they gave him the title, the King of the Jews, in 40 BC. So Herod waged war against his rival. They helped him fight. And in the midst of the war, Herod tried to get the Jewish people to help be on his side. And one way of doing that was he decided to marry his rival's niece to get some Jewish credit. The problem was Herod was already married, already had a son, so he just banished them to marry someone new to help him get the throne. Within 3 years, Herod wasn't just king of the Jews in name, but he became king of the Jews in deed, after he set out and captured Jerusalem. He sent his rival to Mark Antony for execution. He then executed any potential rivals to his throne. Herod then cemented his throne by executing another 45 wealthy people who were opposed to him. So Herod was now officially king of the Jews. He had no biblical right to be king of the Jews. He was not of Jewish lineage. But he was nevertheless reigning as the king of the Jews, whether the people liked it or not. And he was paranoid. You read about Herod. He was paranoid. He was always thinking someone is going to take the throne from him. Now Herod, during his time, he built many great buildings in his territory, many Roman buildings. He wanted to make Jerusalem a very Roman city. He even made a temple to Octavius, Caesar Augustus. So he even made a pagan temple to please these people. He was also very paranoid, and because of his paranoia, he built many fortresses around the place. And so he could flee to them if he had to, if his rule was ever threatened. One of these places he built was the prison where his son killed John the Baptist. He also built a grand fortress about 3 miles southeast of Bethlehem. This fortress, which was humbly called the Herodium, was one of his favorite hangouts. He used to go there a lot, so he used to know the area around Bethlehem a lot, and he actually was buried there later. So he built lots of things. He also built the Masada castle, the fortress. And so he was very paranoid about someone taking his throne. And so if he ever suspected anyone of treason, he killed them. If anyone was going to take the title King of the Jews, he executed them. He executed his family members because he thought they might try to take the throne. In his life, he married 10 wives. In 29 BC, he executed one of his wives, that one he married to get the throne in the beginning. He was jealous over her and thought her and her son were going to take over the throne, so he killed her. He also drowned a young high priest because he believed that the teenager, he was a teenager at the time, had the potential of causing treason. He then executed an 80-year-old priest because he thought he was going to commit treason. There was no evidence. In 7 BC, he strangled the twin sons of his late wife because he imagined they were trying to take the throne. He also executed another of his sons, another Antipater. One author, he writes, plots bred suspicions, and suspicions paranoia, driving the Judean Othello to kill his wife, her grandfather, her mother, 2 brothers-in-law, and 3 of his sons, not to mention numerous subjects. Now, when he was executing all these people, Caesar Augustus even heard about this, and when he executed that's one of his sons, the Roman emperor even created a pun, which you can see it very clear in the Greek. The Roman emperor said, "It is safer to be Herod's pig," in Greek it's hus, "than to be Herod's son, hios." So it's safer to be a pig in Jerusalem than be Herod's son. And to top it off, because Herod knew that many people in his territory would be ecstatic when he died, in order to make sure people mourned for him instead of being happy, he took hundreds of Jewish leaders, and he told his soldiers, "When I die, execute these people so that people will mourn over them and be sad when I die." So that was Herod the Great. And with all that background information, let's look at the text in Matthew chapter 2. And so this is when the Magi arrive. So this is the second part of my sermon, which we will see the true King of the Jews. That was the imposter. Now we'll see the true King. So let's read the first 3 verses of Matthew chapter 2. So Matthew writes, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." So Jesus has been born. We looked at that a bit on Sunday. He was born in Bethlehem, a town that Herod the Great is familiar with. He goes there a lot. It's not far from Jerusalem. He has a fortress nearby. Now at this time, Herod the Great is minding his own business, executing this guy and that guy, normal business. And then these Magi from the east arrive in the city, Jerusalem. So who are these Magi? Well, a Magi simply refers to, it usually refers to magicians or astrologers or wise men. So these wise men come from the east, and they come into Jerusalem, and they're asking people, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Where is he? We have seen his star, and we have come to worship him." And so King Herod then hears about something happening in the city. There are some people from far east, somewhere in the east, some magi, some wise men, asking my people, "Where is the King of the Jews?" Hey, I'm right here. But they're asking, "Where is the one who's born King of the Jews?" They're not asking for Herod. They're asking for a different king, one that has just been born. And so you can imagine being Herod the Great for a moment. You are the King of the Jews. Caesar said, "I'm King of the Jews. I've murdered all my competition. If you smelt like you were going to take my throne, I killed you." And now we have these strange men from the east, some different nation, saying that the King of the Jews has been born. And they've seen a star in the east. They've come to worship him. So imagine hearing this news if you are King Herod the Great. Well, this can't be good. There's news out there that there's another King of the Jews, and these Magi are telling the people of my city all about this. And now these people are also being supernaturally brought here by some star, and they're coming to worship him. So hence why verse 3 says, when Herod the king heard about this, he was troubled, and Jerusalem was troubled as well. The king was troubled. The word troubled refers to having an inward turmoil, a disturbing disposition. And like Matthew says, the city was troubled as well. Now, the city wasn't probably troubled about this baby king, but they were probably troubled about what King Herod's going to do with this news. So here is news of another king in the land, another king of the Jews. So something must be done about this. So Herod tries to do something about it. So he starts off by getting some information. So in verse 4 we read, gathering together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. So he goes and calls all his favorite, religious experts, come and tell me where this Messiah is to be born. And that's pretty interesting because Herod's making a connection right now. Is this the supposed king of the Jews, this Messiah, this one they've come to worship? Is this the Messiah? Now remember, Herod isn't really a Jew, but he nevertheless was declared the king of the Jews. He was raised Jewish, so he probably knows some of the Jewish religion. So he knew that there's a Savior spoken of in the Old Testament that would come. And so Herod is going to make sure that the Savior does not come. This Messiah doesn't come. And so the religious leaders, they go look, grab their fancy theology books, and they look and they say, the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. Look at verses 5 and 6. They, these religious leaders, said to him, Herod, in Bethlehem of Judea. Just so you know, there's two different Bethlehems in Israel. This is Bethlehem of Judea. For this is what has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So these guys knew Micah 5 verse 2, where the prophet Micah said, the Messiah, the everlasting one, is going to come and be born in Bethlehem. And so Herod puts all these clues together. Here are some magi from the east following some star. And this star, which Numbers 24:17 says, a star shall come from Jacob, a scepter shall come from Israel. Now the star could be the sign of a scepter. A scepter is a symbol of a king. And so the star is maybe an indication of this king. We have these men come to worship this supposed king. This must be the Jewish Messiah. The Jewish prophet Micah says the king will come from Bethlehem. And for Herod, he must do something. If this is true, I need to stop this. This shepherd, this king, this Messiah, his own throne's at stake. The inhabitants of Jerusalem mustn't think someone else is the king. I'm the king. So he makes a plan. Verse 7. Then Herod, he secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. So like it says, he secretly calls these Magi, come in, let me ask you something. And they oblige, they come to Herod. They didn't come to Herod in the first place. But he says, come to me. So when did you first see the star? And so Herod's trying to work out the age of this king. How long ago? How long ago? Has he just been born? Is he older, a toddler, a teenager? He's trying to get more information so that, he can worship him. Actually, execute him. Age is not an issue for Herod's executions. He doesn't care about age. He's killed so many of his kids already. Look at verse 8. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I may come and worship him. So he decides to give these Magi some information they did not have. He's in Bethlehem. Go look in Bethlehem. The king's in Bethlehem. That's where you shall find him. And when you find him, come and tell me, because I want to come and worship him. That's a liar. A liar. And the Magi, maybe they believed him. And so in verses 9 to 10, we read, after hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. So they spoke to the king, they leave the king, they go to Bethlehem, not too far from Jerusalem, and they find the child. Not a baby, not an infant, but a child. So after a long journey, they're here. They're here. They found where the star was and they rejoiced. They rejoiced greatly. The text could be translated as they rejoiced with great exceeding joy. They're ecstatic. It's a long journey. They found the person here. They found the King of the Jews, and then they did what they said they would do. They worshipped him. Verse 11, after coming into the house, not stable, house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so the Magi come to this house, and they come where the child is, and but now they want to worship this child. They've come to worship him. They've already spoken to the imposter king, and they didn't bow to him. They didn't even want to go to the imposter king in the first place. They just came because he told them to come. They didn't honor the imposter king. They didn't give gifts to the imposter king, something you normally do. They didn't give gifts to him. But when they came to the true king, they treated him as true royalty. They gave him gifts worthy of royalty, gold, expensive incense called frankincense, and valuable perfume called myrrh. They come to worship Jesus, the true King of the Jews. And once they've worshipped, we see verse 12, and having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. So God then warns them in a dream, which meant they must have slept there at least one night. And in this dream, God warns them, don't go back to the imposter king. And so listening to God is a wise thing to do. Listening to God, they went home a different way. But Herod wasn't done yet. Thus, God not only warns the Magi, but he then warns Joseph, which is Jesus' legal father of the true king. He warns Joseph in a dream. Look at verses 13 to 15. Now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child, to a strong word here, destroy him. That's his intent. Want to destroy the child. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So God warns Joseph through a dream as well, through one of his angels. Wake up. Danger's coming. Take the child. It's interesting. It doesn't say take your child. It says just take the child, because Joseph's not actually the father. He's the legal father. He's not a biological one. But take the child and his mother and flee. Flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you. Why? Because the maniac, the imposter, Herod, is going to look for this child and try to destroy him. King Herod was at war with a kid. War with the true king of the Jews. But Herod, with all his power, couldn't even destroy a little kid in his own kingdom, in a town several miles outside of Jerusalem, near a fortress. He couldn't even kill a kid. Joseph takes his family in the night, leaves for Egypt, and he remains in Egypt until Herod dies. And we're reminded by Matthew that none of this was an accident. It was all prophesied. This would happen to the Son of God, to the Messiah. This was to fulfill what Hosea 11:1 says, out of Egypt I called my son. In the same way God led his people, whom Hosea calls his son, Israel. In the same way God led them out of Egypt, he will lead the true and greater Israel, the true and greater son, Jesus, out of Egypt as well. But in the meantime, Herod has no idea what's going on, doesn't know about the dreams or where the child is. So we read what the mad imposter king does in verses 16 to 18. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged. And he sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted, because they were no more. Herod was exceedingly furious. I've been tricked by these Magi. He actually wasn't tricked, they just didn't come back to him. But the imposter king continued his frenzy, he continued his paranoia to protect his throne at all cost. And now we can see why Jerusalem was disturbed, was troubled when the king heard of this news. Because Herod, not a very rational person, he made a very irrational decision to destroy this child. How am I going to destroy this child? I'm going to kill all the children in the area. That'll make sure I'll kill him. Anyone 2 and under, any male child 2 and under, I will kill in Bethlehem and anywhere around Bethlehem. And before you think, how could he do that? Well, he's done it already before. It's not out of his character. He's an imposter king of the Jews. A true king of the Jews would not emulate one of the Jewish most hated enemies in its history, the king of Egypt in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, who did the same thing. A true king of the Jews wouldn't do this. And all Herod was doing what his ancestors had been trying to do for centuries. The Edomites, the Philistines have been trying to kill the Jews for ages. So he's just doing what they've always done. And while Herod thought he was in control of all this, Matthew reminds us again that Herod was not, since Herod was just doing what Jeremiah the prophet predicted would happen hundreds of years before this. And so then in the midst of Herod trying to hold on to power through absolute tyranny, he ends by losing everything. He dies. Look at verses 19 to 21. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, Get up, take the child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. So Herod the Great died. Just soon after he tried to massacre an entire town of its kids, he died himself. And his death is described as an unidentified but excruciatingly painful, putrefying illness, known to posterity as Herod's evil. That ancient Jewish historian Josephus, he records what Herod's death was like. He says in these words, Herod grew rapidly worse and suffered horrible torments. He had a terrible craving to scratch himself, his bowels were ulcerated, and his privates were gangrenous and wormy. He tried in vain to relieve his gasping and convulsions. Herod was now suffering such terrible agony that he even tried to stab himself, but his cousin stopped him. However, he died anyway. He died in one of his grand palaces in Jericho, and they went and buried him, ironically, in Bethlehem, in his fortress, the Herodium. He killed the children of Bethlehem, and he ended up dead there himself. And this fortress, once a beauty, now is an empty shell. Archaeologists have recently found this burial place, and as one author writes, not surprisingly, the tomb and this royal sarcophagus have been shattered into pieces, probably by later zealots who also hated him. The imposter king tried to preserve his legacy through murder, and yet he is no more. His legacy is tainted, his burial destroyed, accomplishments were ruined, and right now suffering justly for his sins against a holy God. But on the other hand, this child we've read about, Jesus, the true King of the Jews, his legacy still preserved through holiness and righteousness. His legacy is honored, his death is proclaimed, his accomplishments are amazed at, and right now he is standing at the right hand of God. No one could stop this king. He was a boy. Well, he wasn't even doing anything right now, but yet fully in control of everything. No one could stop him, not even when he was a 2-year-old boy. Not even a great human king could stop him. But the attacks on Jesus did not stop. Look at verses 22 to 23. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. So when Herod died, what happened was his kingdom was split and divided into 3 parts and given to his sons. Archelaus, mentioned here in Matthew, he ruled over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Herod Philip II, who's mentioned in Luke chapter 3, he ruled the regions north of Galilee. And then you had Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee and Perea. However, when Joseph heard that Herod's one son Archelaus ruled over Judea, Joseph was scared. Why? Because Archelaus was just like his father, cruel, evil. He had executed 3,000 Jews for a revolt they weren't even a part of. So God warns Joseph in a dream, warns Joseph to not go back to Bethlehem, but to the regions of Galilee, which were under the jurisdiction of a different son, Herod Antipas. And so they went and lived in Nazareth. And again, all parts of God's plan to show that this is the true king of the Jews. Because this move also showed that this is the true king because the prophets predicted it. Which prophet predicted this? About being in Nazareth? Well, there's not even one reference to Nazareth in the Old Testament. It's a nobody town, about 70 miles north of Jerusalem. Its name is associated with derision. Just think of what Philip said of Nazareth in the Gospel of John. He said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It was a nobody town. No one liked it. So the idea here about Matthew is probably, as one author writes, Matthew is using Nazarene as a synonym for someone who is despised or detestable. If that is the case, the prophecies Matthew has in mind would concern those prophecies that Jesus would become from a lowly place. And so the mere geography concerning Jesus, his birth, even the geography tells us he's the true king. Herod's geography, not the true king. He's from Edom and Philistia. He's not a true king. But this one, the prophet said he'll be born in Egypt. The prophet said he would be born in Bethlehem. The prophets also said he would live in Egypt for a bit. And they said he would be a Nazarene, a suffering servant, despised, a place of no importance. And no imposter king could stop that. Not King Herod, not his son Archelaus, who ruled so poorly he was even disposed by the Emperor Augustus, banishing him to southern France. The emperor then replaced these horrible Herods with Roman governors to truly rule, and then the Jews became real puppets then after that. But again, nothing could stop the king of the Jews, not Herod the Great, not his son Archelaus, not even another son, Herod Antipas, not the 5th Roman governor of this region, Pontius Pilate. Not sin could not stop him. The ruler of the world couldn't even stop him. Satan couldn't stop him. Death couldn't stop him. For the true king of the Jews lives on, not merely through our proclamation, but because he lives. And I hope that you remember this, that the true king of the Jews, he lives. No one can stop him. In Psalm chapter 2, God laughs at the kings and nations of the world who try to stop him. No one's going to stop him. You're not going to stop him. I'm not going to stop him. And when he returns to fully and rightfully reign over this world, not just over Judea, like Herod, but over the world, he will ensure only his people, his chosen people, those who are saved by faith alone, by grace alone, in him alone, will come into his kingdom with him. And he won't just be the king of the Jews, he'll be king of all things. He'll be king of kings. And if as a boy a great king couldn't stop him, then who are we to think we can stop him? So we have to come to him today. Come and simply do what the Magi did. Worship him. Don't try and stop him. Everyone who tried to stop him didn't have a good ending. Let's pray.